role in the landscape and a lot of the strategies we're trying to do here at DNR, whether it's wildlife protection, clean water, rural development and economic development, carbon, all of the many benefits that you all are providing, from wood products to clean air and water. And we really want to lean in and develop that more. So that's the spirit that we've been talking with Elaine and your board, and really looking forward to doing that across the board here and digging in on this conversation. So I'll turn it over to Alex, our deputy of forest resilience. And Alex, do you have anything else you want to share?
Yeah, I thought I would just dive in and introduce the team, the DNR team, and give a quick overview of how we thought we'd approach answering all your questions and having a good discussion about FREP. So with us today, we've got Joe Schrammick, who is the division manager for the Forest Regulation Program. We have Mary McDonald, who is an assistant division manager, also in that program. Tammy Makita, who is the head of the Small Forest Landowner Office, and Dan Pomerank, who is part of our FREP program. So we wanted to go ahead and answer all the questions that you guys sent to us. We really appreciate you taking the time to put those together. What we're going to do is walk through a PowerPoint that we think gives an overview of the FREP program for folks who aren't that familiar with it. And then also in the context of that PowerPoint, we try to answer as many of the questions you sent over as we can. But we've thoroughly answered them. And so if we didn't get to everything you wanted to know in your questions, then let us know at the end and we'll make sure we dive right back into that. We definitely heard some themes in those questions. One is the time frame from when somebody submits a FREP application to when folks get a check. The second one is how the valuation is done of the easement. And the third one is transparency around the process. Folks, it seems folks want to know more about how this is done and have more transparency around how DNR does its work with the FREP program. So with all that said, we really look forward to a good conversation about this, and I will pass it over to Mary McDonald, who has the PowerPoint.
Just before you do that, can you just say a couple of words about, I always label you as the new Stephen Bernath, but you're not really, because of the reorg and sort of that overall vision of how this resiliency and regulation are fitting together, because I think that helps people put all of this stuff in context. Just a couple of minutes on that, and then we'll figure out how to give Mary the podium and the ability to share her screen.
Okay, awesome. Sure. So my name's Alex Smith. I am taking Stephen Bernath's place, but we did a reorganization after that big Bill 1168 was passed in the legislature last session. The legislature gave DNR 125 million over the biennium for both to address wildfire and how we respond to wildfires, but also a lot about prevention. How do we ensure we've got forest health so that the wildfires are less catastrophic when they do come? And so the agency decided the best thing to do was to separate out the wildfire folks into their own division and to expand what they're able to do with all that additional funding, and then move over the folks who did the forest health piece, which is, forest health treatments to reduce material that can burn easily, to go after bugs and crud, for insect invasions and forest diseases. So all of those folks are now under one division, and I am at the top of that. So I am doing what Stephen Bernath did when it comes to the forest regulation side of the world, a forest practice application, and the various incentive programs that you guys can take advantage of. And the commissioner is also, as part of this reorganization, said she really wants, as Tom said, to focus on customer service. So we are trying to expand the ways in which we are available to you all and to help you guys in whatever resources you need, whether it's gaining access to one of these incentive programs or it's having a forester come out and walk the land with you and help you put together a management plan, whatever it may be. So we can have a separate meeting to talk about that if you guys would like, but that's the nature of the reorg.
Okay, so I'll start. And Elaine, thanks for asking us. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the PowerPoint presentation up and go through it. And then hopefully, Elaine, if you and Tammy don't mind jumping in and interrupting me,
if someone has their hands up or if they want to ask a question. And I believe that we got all of your questions, and the PowerPoint is going to answer a lot of them, and then I'll go into some narrative or ask the rest of the team, Tammy and Dan, to help out with some additional details regarding the questions. And then I'd say let's go and just jump in and don't hesitate to interrupt. Okay, so I'm Mary McDonald, and a little bit about me and my background. I was in the field for quite some time, actually implementing the small forest landowner office programs, and I guess I was hired by Steve Stinson initially, and then worked in the small forest landowner office in Clark, Cowitz, and Thurston, and Grace Harbor, and implementing the small forest landowner programs, and then also working as a forest practice forester. I then started managing the small forest landowner office after Steve left, and then went down to Pacific Cascade region, working in state lands for 7 years, and then coming back to the forest practice, now forest regulation program, and I'm back working with the team. A little bit more about me is actually I'm a member, my husband and I are a member of your chapter in Lewis County, and we own property in Lewis and in Grace Harbor County that are tree farms, and we're very, very proud of them. So, but that's not why I'm here today. Today is to talk about the Small Forest Landowner Office, and specifically FREP, and some of your questions. So let's get going. Okay, so this is the a couple of, we're going to talk about the Forest Riparian Easement Program primarily, but I also wanted to highlight some of the other programs that the Small Forest Landowner Office has. And so it has a Family Forest Fish Passage program that we implement, and the Rivers and Habitat Open Space program. And then we are gearing up, we currently have a regulatory assistance program, but we are very excited with the new money that's come in that we will be expanding that program. And over at the right of this slide, you're able to see how it's implemented. Tammy is the lead of the Small Forest Landowner Office as the program manager. And then Dan Pomerink, who's here, is the lead regarding the FREP program. And Lori Cox is the lead with the Family Forest Fish Passage program. And then we are currently recruiting for someone to lead the regulatory and assistance program, and that will be expanded. Rivers and Habitat Open Space program we have recently hired, and I'm sure probably many of you haven't met her yet, is Kellyanne Ricks, and she'll be working in and along with Dan Pomerink on the Forest Riparian Easement program, because that's a full-time job, more than a full-time job. Okay, next one. Let's see how I'm going. Okay, what I'm going to do is just go over very briefly at a pretty high level the Forest Riparian Easement program, because I think that we have a diverse knowledge of the background of the program in the audience. You know, some might be hearing it for the first or second time, and then some may also, landowners out there may actually have an easement and are contemplating a second easement and want additional information. So I'm trying to touch the diverse level of knowledge on this program. It's a 50-year conservation easement program. And what it does is it compensates landowners for the trees that they are required to leave when they do an adjacent upland harvest. Many of the costs that you have to incur when you lay out or apply for the easement program are reimbursed to you, and it is based on a first come, first serve priority, like when you turn it in. When you turn in your FREP application to the Small Forest Landowner Office. What are the trees that are required to be left? They would be trees that are along a creek, a riparian management zone. They could be also trees left in the channel migration zone, or in unstable slopes areas, or in wetland management zones. Who can apply, or who is eligible for the FREP program? It's a for-profit, non-government, small forest landowner that harvests less than 2 million board feet on average over 3 years. And you must not be eligible for a 20-acre exempt rule. That's 20-acre exempt rule allows a small forest landowner to harvest, have a much smaller RMZ. And the FREP program was initiated as part of the mitigation for forest and fish for small forest landowners having to have a larger buffer than they probably anticipated when they purchased the property. It can't be a conversion, and an FPA must be submitted to initiate the process. Okay, what's the FREP process?
Mary, just before you go, one question. You said no encumbrances on the property. Give me an example of an encumbrance, because I'm thinking, well, if you've purchased it and you're making payments on it, is that considered an encumbrance, or is there something else?
Okay, yep, sorry, let me see if I can go back. I wanted to go back, hang on.
Yeah, you probably don't have to, but
There, that's
no
okay.
encumbrances. What does that
No
mean?
encumbrance on the property. I think if the bank owns a portion of it, you've taken out a loan, we can work with a subordination agreement. And that is when the bank says, okay, yes, you can, we will take a second in line in order for you to get a conservation easement or a FREP on your property. The landowner and the bank have to do that. The state, Washington State, wants to be first in line when it puts on an easement on your property. When we talk about encumbrance, it could be, like I remember a couple of times that we had a couple of vehicles that were in the RMZs. When it's looking at, we don't want anything hazardous, or that's something that the state is not willing to take on as far as an easement, because it is the state that is purchasing the trees. Is that helpful?
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, and I am going to go into this process in a lot more detail to address some of your questions, but let's just an overview, like I said. We want to fill out a forest practice application, and then after the harvest is complete, then you'll submit a forest riparian easement application, and that's online, and you can download it, and then you submit it to the small forest landowner office. When the small forest landowner office it has a list as far as when those applications are coming in, and then we'll go out and we'll ensure that the application is eligible for the program as we move down, and then we cruise the actual, we hire a third-party cruiser, so it's not someone that works for the landowner, and it's not someone that works for DNR. And they go out and will cruise the trees that are required to be left along the RMZ. I'm just going to probably default and use RMZ a lot. RMZ is a riparian management zone, and that is, I would say, 90% of the easements that we acquire are RMZs. And then the cruiser will report the volume and the species and the quality of the species and the volume to the SFLO. Then the SFLO will then determine the compensation and make an offer to the landowner. Once that offer is been accepted, or there's questions involved, that can go back to SFLO. But then the actual transaction, because it is a real estate transaction, it does go through an escrow company, And once that is done, then the easement is registered on the property through the county.
So there's a question, Mary. Ken Miller has a question. He says a common misunderstanding by SFLOs is that the easement encumbers the land. As I understand it, the easement is only on the trees, correct?
That is correct. That is correct. It's only on the trees. That is absolutely correct, but it is assigned to the property, so that that you would be able to look it up and see if you were looking on the parcel on a title search, that you would see that there is an encumbrance on that parcel, but it is on the trees.
Okay. There's one more question from Susan Streifel. She says, I didn't understand, if we have a 20-acre family forest, how does this program apply? And I think you're referring to the 20-acre exempt.
Yeah, no, that's if you only own 20 acres, and you know, I don't mean to say only, because 20 acres is a lot of work. If you have 20 acres, the requirement of leaving trees along a fish-bearing stream is much smaller than for someone that owns more than 20 acres. And so the legislature, this program cannot apply to you. It's for landowners that own more than 20 acres. Okay, and FREP implementation, where do we get our direction from? Well, here it is. And when I refer to an RCW, it's called a Revised Code of Washington, and that is direction that originates with the legislature. So that in order for us to change something or to implement it differently, we would have to go back to the legislature and say, or you would have to go back to the legislature and say, hey, we want this change. It would take a legislative action to bring about a different way. And then we also have what frequently follows up is once we have a legislative direction, then the Forest Practice Board has followed up with passing forest practice rules, and they're under the revised Washington administration codes, and they're called WACs. So RCW comes from the legislature. Legislature gives direction, and then the Forest Practice Board passes rules, and there are, you know, it's a hierarchy, and of course the legislature comes first and then the Forest Practice Board comes second. But that's a lot. I would say the majority of how we are implementing FREP comes from either one of those two sources. There are several things that are either DNR or small forest landowner policy, and don't hesitate if I don't bring that out as which of these directions or where is this direction coming from. And most of these slides that are going to follow, I have referenced either an RCW legislature or a WAC if that direction is coming from those, and they would need to change. It's not something that the small forest landowner office can flip a switch and then all of a sudden do something differently if we're getting the direction from either of those. Okay. All right. Here I wanted to share, and I just love this graph, and I want to thank Dan Pomerink for coming up with it. It shows FREP and a lot of our programs, I think, in a snapshot. And here you can see that a number of applications that we have initiated in 2002 going to 2021, the number of easements that are purchased, cancellations, or people that have submitted applications and then they're deemed ineligible, and then the waiting list. And then you can also see the amount of funding that we have received biennium. A biennium is 2 years, and that's how the legislature appropriates our funding. And so you can see the total of easements that we've required has been 435. and that we have about 110 currently on the waiting list. Okay. Okay, easements. How many easements have been, like I said, acquired since 2002? And what's been appropriated is 36.8 million to acquire that 435 easements. Sorry, I said 435 easements have been acquired, and 36.8 million. Easements values, the amount of money that a landowner receives, of course, depends on the amount and the quality of timber or trees on the qualifying timber. And the values have, like it says, the values have ranged from either $800 to $830,000, from a quarter acre to 172 acres. And then again, like I said, that we have about over 100 applications in the queue today. That changes, when we get a new application in. So 6 months from now, we might have 109, and then we're working on applications. So that number is a constantly changing number. A lot of the questions that you guys asked had to do with timing. And so here is, and these are averages, but this is our current status. A timber cruise takes from the time that you turn in a FREP application to the Small Forest Landowner Office, it's about 3 to 4 years. Currently, right now, we are working on applications, FREP applications that were submitted 5 years ago. And we're pretty excited about this biennium because we had an increase. If we go back to that other piece, we've usually had between $2 or $3 billion appropriated in a biennium, but this biennium we have 6.4. So we are going to be able to move a lot of easements, we hope, and decrease that backlog by quite a bit.
So Mary, this is Elaine. I have a question for you on the timing of the timber cruise. Why do you delay that for so long if the application has been received? Because, timber changes over time.
Yes, yep, nope, and that is a concern for landowners regarding whether timber, if it's going to fall down or, with wind throw after a harvest that's been adjacent to the RMZ. It's not that we delay it, it's what are we putting our priority on? We have a certain amount of resources that are available to implement FREP, and we are, as soon as that we know that we have funding, like the 6.4, right now we just completed assigning a cruise contract, and we're getting ready to do another. And then at the same time, those other the same people that are administering the cruise contracts, we have to make maps, we have to go out there and verify that it's qualifying timber, and then put it up for cruise. They are also the same people that are implementing the FREP as far as doing the evaluations and working with escrow. So like I said, it's a matter of resources. It's not, let's set those aside. It's okay, we got money, let's go. And we're working as fast as we can.
Mary, Ken Miller has another question. He says the last time legislature changed FREP, they increased DNR's flexibility with the intent to get cruises and valuations done within about 1 year to avoid the loss to the small forest landowner due to blowdown. What's the current goal for getting cruises done?
Like I said, as soon as we have funding, there's a trade-off there. We have resources to be able to implement FREP, and we've just hired a third forester to be able to do that. But we're also balancing if we spend the money for cruises, then that's less money to acquire easements. And so we are balancing how many easements can we acquire and how fast can we get the easements completed and then have the cruise done. And that's a balance that we look at every time, every biennium is, okay, we're going to get how many easements completed and how many cruises are we going to be able to accomplish. Okay, so one of the questions that you asked had to do with the FREP date. And when is it started as far as the 50-year clock? And is the FREP easement, when do I get on the list? And this is referenced in RCW. And so this would have to be changed. If you wanted to change this was legislative change. And in RCW, it identifies the time that the FREP application is received to the SFLO. And that's when you get on the queue. That's when the value of the qualifying timber is based on the market on that date, unless the landowner has submitted mill receipts that would show something, within 3 months difference. And that's on an average 3 months. And the FREP clock starts on that date. It is not the time, if you've been in the queue for 5 years, that 5 years has contributed so that by the time you sign the easement may be for 45 years if you've been on the queue for 5.
There's one more question, Mary, about blowdown. Nick Samaro says, I have the understanding that if timber blew down after the application was submitted, the blowdown could be included in the cruise.
That's correct.
That is correct.
That is correct. It's anything that is viable. They do cruise down timber. It's anything that is viable when the cruise is out there. That's correct.
Are they basing it on the value? I mean, you think about blowdown and it decays after a while, especially if it's something like alder. And so is the valuation as it would have been when you harvested the timber, or is it only as when they cruise it? I mean, 4 years later, you could have a lot of decay in your alder.
It's at the time that they were out there, Elaine, when the cruiser is out there. So it might be 4 years later.
Okay.
Okay. FREP statistics, that's like a broad topic. Sorry about that. One of the questions was how much of the FREP budget is utilized by DNR. And over the last 3 or 4 biennium, we took an average and it runs about 12%. And that pays for Dan Pomerank and his staff that work 100% on FREP. And we have a separate code, and anytime they're working on FREP, it's charged to it. And what do? These are some of the tasks that they do regarding FREP, but definitely not all of them. It's identifying the qualifying timber, administering the cruise contracts, determining the easement, and then preparing the documents for escrow, and then working with the landowner, answering any questions that the landowner has, and then facilitating the signatures of all the documents, and then making the documents prepared for our finance department that'll cut the check.
So are the cruise contracts included as part of that 12%, or are they in addition to the 12%? Because that must be a good chunk of cash.
It is. It is. No, it is not. The 12% is for DNR staff and these tasks. And another one was like, no, the 12%, like for our budget for this biennium, and it's just because we just did it in the last week, I wouldn't recall it normally, but we're planning on about 340,000 to go to cruising for cruise contracts out of our budget for this biennium.
How many acres? I should go into cruising at that amount. How
Yeah,
many acres?
I don't know, Elaine. See, we get an application, we make a ballpark, and that's a plan. And when someone turns in an application, we kind of make an estimate of how many acres it may be, but we don't have a definite number until we get out there.
Okay, super, thanks.
Yep. And small forest landowner, who's eligible? One of the questions had to do with who's eligible for the small forest landowner and whether they were a family forest landowner. And this is again in RCW and in WAC as far as who is eligible for the forest riparian easement program. One of the questions was also why there's the perception is that it is because of the 5 years or so before a landowner may drop out of the forest riparian easement program. And what we have done is when we have a landowner drop out of the program, we call them up and we ask, because to be honest with you, if they drop out after we have already paid for a cruise and gone out there and spent a lot of time identifying the qualifying timber, putting a value on it, and started the documentation, we average that's about $20,000 that we have invested in an application and then don't have it see through to fruition. And so we make an honest effort, and these are reasons why the landowners, these are the reasons that we have been given by landowners on why they have chose not to move forward with a FREP. And frequently and this is by the number of, and it's about 17% of the applications that come in decide to cancel, or they are deemed ineligible. And they would be deemed ineligible as by the time a landowner turns in an application, and then we go through and we check, okay, how big is their parcel? Well, it's 20 acres. Well, then we notify the landowner that they're not eligible for FREP because they have a 20-acre parcel and they were able to take advantage of a smaller RMZ buffer. But more likely than not, it's not that they're ineligible, it's that they have canceled. When think of our own lives, and a lot of people have lives change in 5 years. And they've either sold the property or the existing landowner that signed up has subsequently passed it on to a family member and the family member's not interested. The 10-year moratorium. 10-year moratorium is an RCW that was passed that if a landowner goes through the FREP program and sells their property within 10 years to somebody other than a small forest landowner, they have to pay a portion of that money back that they were that they received because of a FREP to the state. And that again is an RCW.
And so, Mary, there was a question about, is there a way to change that RCW? He said, Ken Lentz said that as a longtime timber owner who has property surrounded by industrial owners, this restricts our options for the 10-year moratorium plus the 5 years we have to wait to get a FREP. At 70 years old, this impacts decision-making to pass on ownership to heirs. And
Definitely.
so, yeah,
That 10-year moratorium, like I referred to, that's an RCW, so that's legislation. That would have to be changed by the legislature. And that date is in the legislature too. And that's the date that the easement is signed. That's specific in legislation.
and when does the 10-year resale clock start?
That's in legislation, and that's at the date that the easement is signed.
Correct. So Heather, did that describe the 10-year moratorium sufficient for you? I know you were asking us to go into more detail.
Yes, but I would like to have the RCW. I realize you might not have it right now, but I want to.
Oh, no, I do. Hang on a second. It is RCW 76 13 120 10 parentheses I. And we can send that to you.
Mm-hmm.
I can look it up. No worries.
Okay.
And then Ken Miller had one quick question. Do FREP funds from the legislature go away if not committed before the end of the biennium?
Good question, Ken. We ask for reappropriation. And like this last biennium, because of COVID, we were not able to get as many easements or go out in the field as quickly as we, as we have done in the past. And so we asked for a reappropriation, and we did get it, and then it goes back into the FREP budget.
So I have one more comment. If you go back to that last slide, it refers to the 20-acre, I'll say 20-acre exemption.
Yes.
That, in my mind, that would not be a reason somebody would drop out. That would be a reason that DNR would determine they are not eligible. Oh, I guess this does say canceled or ineligible. Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about, this is complex, and I'm going to talk about the FREP valuation, and it's a two-step process. And the first step is determining the qualifying timber. And we look at the Department of Revenue stumpage table, or if the small landowner provides document, the small harvest tax return method. What we look at are both of those if the information is there. If not, we defer to the stumpage table from Department of Revenue for the qualifying timber. But if we do have the additional information, we always go with the highest compensation value. Then also the legislature wanted us, in determining the compensation, to consider the amount of regulatory impact on the small forest landowner on that forest practice application. And this is the second step. And I'm just going to read it. And the compensation offered, will be increased to 100% for that portion of the regulatory impact that is in excess of the applicable high impact regulatory threshold. Okay, so the regulatory threshold, that is also in RCW. There's a regulatory impact on the east side, 19.1%, and then a different one from the east side. And what we do when we consider the compensation is we need the information from the timber harvest, and then we also look at how much with that third-party cruise information is impacted, or was the landowner impacted because they had to leave that amount of timber. So we're looking at the upland harvest as a whole, and then how much was specifically left based on the cruise that we have done in the riparian area. And with that cruise, then we bring in, that's the volume, the species, and we're able to determine that. But we also need the total value of the harvest, the total volume of the harvest by species, and then the harvesting and marketing costs to be able to assess and measure, take into account that regulatory impact on that specific harvest. And this is where there might be some confusion, because that's when we're looking at for that specific harvest, not a broad area like the Department of Revenue stumpage tables. We're looking for that specific information from that harvest. And now I'm gonna ask Dan Pomerink to jump in and clarify things that may need some more information. Dan, do you have, please offer more information or another perspective on explaining this complicated thing.
Yeah, sometimes the regulatory impact can be difficult to comprehend, but if you just picture that your the qualifying timber and the harvest values, those two put together, is your total value that you have. And so the impact, the regulatory impact, is determined by the relationship of that value of the easement with the relationship to the value of the harvest. And that's why we need the actual harvest costs for that. So hopefully that's a little bit better, another way of showing it. Unfortunately, the way the WAC describes it is not as clear as perhaps it could be. But yeah, if anybody wants me to go through specific examples one-on-one, I'd be more than happy to.
I think this is perhaps the hottest topic of the entire discussion. So we just want to we want to dig into it a little bit, because there is, as near as we can read, and maybe you're reading this different, there's nothing in the WAC that states which method must be used for determining this value for hitting this regulatory threshold. Just like there's the option to use all of the detail that you might be able to provide if you entered into an agreement that wasn't a lump sum sale. So in a lump sum sale, your harvester comes to you and says, hey, I'll give you, I don't know, $100,000 because that's a nice round number. And then they're managing and selling the timber and they're getting the mill receipts, et cetera, et cetera. You don't actually see all that other data, but you know that you got $100,000 for your 10 acres of timber or whatever.
Yeah. So there's two different processes, and the one that the WAC speaks to mostly is for us to be able to actually give you a value using the mill receipt process. However, for simply determining the percent of impact, all we need is the dollar amount of the harvest, which is a lump sum. So if it's 100,000, then that's what we use for that regulatory impact. If we have receipts, we have to have receipts that's what you received. And my assumption also is that you would have to then report that same amount to the Department of Revenue as well. And so either that Department of Revenue receipt or the receipt that you received from the logger would be enough for us to calculate the regulatory impact. However, it wouldn't be enough for us to be able to calculate your qualifying timber using your stumpage value that you receive from the mill. Like, for example, Doug fir, no way I would be able to figure out what you got paid for your Doug fir or your Western hemlock. So therefore, we would not be able to match up those values for the values in the RMZ. Therefore, we could not we would not be able to provide you with a value using that method. We would only be able to provide you a value using the method, a qualifying timber value using the method, using the tax tables. So there's two things. We're determining the qualifying timber value by two different methods, and then we're also determining what the high impact regulatory threshold is. Now, of course, if we have all your delivered values, your total volume by species, and your actual harvesting marketing costs, obviously that's going to give us the information to be able to figure out your regulatory impact as well. But we have taken lump sum, but it has to be actual dollar amounts that you received in your pocket. It can't be an estimate, and we have to see the receipts.
So, but wouldn't you be able to figure out the value of the species, like the Doug fir or the hemlock or whatever that's left in the riparian zone, based on the stumpage tables? You're saying
that's what we do. We do both methods. We do it using a stumpage table. That's the default method. And then if we have enough information from the landowner, we're able to do it in the second method. And WAC 222-21045 specifically says the only way DNR can provide the applicant with that qualifying timber value is if the landowner can provide us all those things, the delivered value, the volume by species, and those things. So that would be enable us to come up with both of the actual qualifying timber values. So we'll have two qualifying timber values. We choose the highest value to then figure out what the regulatory impact is. So we take the regulatory impact is the relationship between the qualifying timber value and the harvest value. That gives us that regulatory impact, and so we were able to figure that out from a total dollar amount. But if you give us just a lump sum, then all we can do is value the qualifying timber using the tables. We're not able to value the qualifying timber using the stumpage, the receipts.
Yeah, but if you can value the qualifying table using qualifying timber using the tables, I guess this is where the confusion in the minds of everybody is. Well, if you can do it that way already for step one, why can't you do it for step two, the high impact piece? That's where the struggle is, and I think
because the landowner knows what the dollar value is that they receive, right?
Yes.
Okay, so there's no reason in our mind to not share that. And if there is a reason to share it, then you're not providing all the information we need to get an actual a correct value for this. So by holding back information is not, providing DNR with the information we need in order to properly come up with a value. Those timber tables for a harvest would be inappropriate to use that in my mind, because we already have the other information, and for us to use a dollar amount that is not, is only an estimate over an entire range of a part of Washington State would not be an estimate of the actual percentage of value in the harvest.
Totally. So I guess what we're trying to distinguish here is we're able to do it, but when it's asking for the regulatory impact, that's considered for a specific harvest and the specific regulatory impact on that landowner. It's not over a geographic area that the stumpage tables reflect. And if the landowner has that information, which they most likely do, they realize how much money that they received. That's what we're asking for is, okay, provide that to us so that we can make an accurate assessment of the regulatory impact on your property on that timber harvest.
So I think that
so that's always over the 50%. So this is what would get it up to like 89.9%.
Right, Mary, but the point is that if you do a lump sum sale and you put in, and you get 100,000 for your 10 acres or whatever it is, it's just, that's a low number, but let's just say you got that, and you have 3 acres or 4 acres in the riparian zone. If you got a lump sum sale, you don't have all that other stuff. You can say to DNR, here, I got 100,000 for this, but I don't know what the volume by species was because it was a lump sum sale.
Mhm.
And so providing that information, you're saying that's insufficient to estimate a high,
Regulatory impacts, yeah.
but I thought Dan just said that they could do it 2 different ways.
Well, so we're talking 2 different things. We're talking the value of the qualifying timber and the value of the easement. So the first thing we do is we first determine the qualifying timber value. The qualifying timber value can be determined 2 different ways. One, using the mill receipts if we have them. If we don't have them, then all we can do is provide one value. Okay, so there's those 2 values. Now, when we get to valuing the easement, which is different than the value of the qualifying timber, then we can apply the high impact regulatory threshold. Okay, so if we don't have the numbers, the information to be able to determine the qualifying timber value using mill receipts, if we have lump sum, we can't determine that value. But we can, using just the lump sum, not the species or anything, just the dollar amount, we can determine the easement value from the high impact regulatory threshold that we are able to calculate. But again, we have to have actual numbers.
Dan, just to be clear, I want to just make sure we're saying is that we would be able to determine the high impact threshold if a landowner gave us the delivered value for if they were to do a lump sum. Is that correct? That they could
That's
qualify?
correct.
Okay.
Yep. So if a person who has just lump sum, yes, they are not going to be able to have their qualifying timber valued both ways, but they will have it valued one way. But if they give us just a lump sum amount, even though we're only valuing the qualifying timber one way, we can still provide a high impact regulatory threshold value, which will then goes to determine the easement value. But without actual numbers.
Right, but then again, we're still going back to, we do need a receipt or something, not just a landowner saying, hey, I got $100,000. We're looking for actual information from the buyer or from the Department of Revenue.
Right. And I saw Ken Miller's question, and yes, we can get gross values or net values or whatever, and we do have default harvesting marking costs. So yeah, so there's different ways that a landowner can get paid for their timber and their harvest. We realize that some of the ways that they get paid isn't as friendly to FREP as others, but as long as we can get actual dollar amounts from the harvest, then we can go forward with determining the high impact regulatory threshold. If we don't have those numbers, then we're stuck with only providing you 50% of the value of the qualifying timber.
Howard Wilson, question?
Go ahead, Howard.
Go ahead, Howard.
Just for clarification, so we have a $100,000 sale. I've got a copy of my contract. I've got a copy of the check where I got paid $100,000. I've filed my forest taxes based on the $100,000 I received. We don't have mill receipts, but based on your cruise and using stumpage values, you value the FREP timber at $40,000. or say $50,000. So then it appears that I would be eligible for FREP compensation above the regulatory 19.6% for Western Washington. Is that generally correct? My point is that just because we do a lump sum, we haven't lost the ability to go above the 50% compensation threshold.
Yeah, if you have $100,000 harvest and $40,000 easement, yes, we are able to determine, use those in the formula that you've seen. We put those numbers in the formula, and then it would spit out what your regulatory impact was, and then it would also tell you what your easement value is. So yes, you would be able to do that.
Yeah, one of my members of the Grace Harbor chapter has had problems in the past, or Maori, and somebody had told him that he couldn't get above the 19.6% compensation because his was a lump sum agreement.
No, okay. Well, I
Would you be willing
apologize
to
for
relook that?
Yeah, I apologize for the mix-up on that, but I don't believe that's true. But I wasn't privy to that conversation, so there might have been other things that were said. But simply on the basis on the information you've provided, they would be eligible for the regulatory impact if they have the numbers. Again, it has to be verifiable numbers.
Yes. Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
have
it
a
has
problem
to
with
be
that.
Yeah, good. A couple of things I want to jump in and Ms. Murray talked lengthily with Dan and very familiar with the program. So I would just encourage a small landowner to get in touch with Dan when they have specific information and when they have questions. Would be happy to. I also saw that one of the questions was how many of the FREP applications have received the high impact threshold, and we are not keeping track of this number currently, but we did up until about 2009, and about 85% of the FREP applications at that time were able to take advantage of the high impact threshold. So 85%.
That kind of makes sense because if you're really hit hard, you're going to want to enter this. And if you're not, yeah, maybe not.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So this is Heather. So if I heard correctly, you only kept track up until, did you say 2009?
That's correct.
So for the past 12 years, we don't know what the percentage is.
That's correct.
Given the concern of our members, I think it would be very helpful to know if there's a perception that in the early days, it was much easier to get the high impact payment and that now it's much more difficult to get the high impact payment. We don't know that because you don't have the data. I think it would be helpful to kind of calm the situation down if we were able to know, has there been a change in the percentage of applications that qualify for high impact?
I would say that there probably has been a change, not in how we have been valuing FREP, but in the applications, based on exactly what Elaine referred to, is when FREP first started, people that were impacted a great deal knew. And if you're 100% impacted, for instance, we just did an easement 2 weeks ago with a landowner that their entire property was in a channel migration zone, 100% impacted. No, they're not going to have mill receipts. They're not going to, but we know that. We can look at an application and see they're 100% impacted. And that goes immediately. We know that it's going to hit the high impact threshold. And those applications came in, I would say, hot and heavy in the very beginning of FREP. And there's not as many people or land out there that have those type of situations. And so I would expect it to decrease. but I don't have that information.
I'm sorry to butt in here, but I think Mary just gave an example that might help the conversation a little bit. So Mary, take the example that you just gave. It's almost 100% in RMZ, but let's say the landowner had a little bit outside the RMZ that they could harvest, and it was only $10,000, and everything inside the RMZ or channel migration zone was $200,000. The way we are hearing what you're saying is if that landowner that got $10,000, if it was in the form of a lump sum payment for $10,000, he would not qualify for high impact. However, if he had mill receipts for all the logs and the grades and everything that total up to that $10,000, he would qualify for the high impact calculation. I think that's the example and the confusion that we're hearing. I thought I heard Dan say that if you get a lump sum payment, just as long as you provide us a copy of that lump sum payment somehow, a deposit, a canceled check, whatever you submitted to DOR in the way of total gross receipts, that would be okay. But that doesn't quite jive with when we dig into the details. That's where the confusion is.
I think you summarized it well, Ken. That's exactly what I heard Dan say. Is that if you give us some documentation?
That's not quite what I heard myself say.
Okay, go again.
So what I thought you heard you say is that if a landowner has $14,000 easement and $100,000 harvest, then they would not be eligible for determining a high impact regulatory threshold, and that's not true. We can determine the high impact regulatory threshold. However, that small amount, it might be less than 19% actually, if we did the math. And then if that's the case, then you would fall below the threshold and then you would only get 50%. So if you have, a large harvest and a small RMZ dollar amount, you might actually be below the 19%, which then limits you to 50% of the qualifying timber value. So there's two values again to think of. There's the qualifying timber value, and then there's the easement value. And it seems like appears that we have a mix-up between the two values.
Yeah. Let me make the example even clearer with a yes or no question. Let's say you determine the value inside of what you can't cut is $100,000, and the landowner got $10,000 for what he was able to harvest outside of the RMZ. And he got that $10,000 in the form of a lump sum payment. Right. No details behind it. He's got a canceled check or something. Obviously, that would be high impact. Will DNR accept that canceled check or whatever document he has or she has about the value was $10,000? Not just making up a number and saying it. You gotta verify it. Would that in that example, would the landowner qualify for the high impact calculations?
Yes, they would, Ken.
Okay. That, in my mind, clears up a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and the key there is when you said that the documentation is acceptable to the small forest landowner's office. So it could be a canceled check if that's appropriate. If we feel that's we have to know that have some sort of knowledge that that's comprehensive, that's not just one of two payments, that kind of stuff. So
yeah, and that would also be backed up by his forest tax documents that he files, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, that is a big additional document that definitely helps the small forest landowner determine that that the information you're giving us is stuff we can use to determine the high impact regulatory threshold.
Complicated subject, especially over Zoom or GoTo, whatever we're on today. But thank you, Dan. Thanks for asking the question. And we still are getting, like I said, in the last couple weeks, we processed an easement where a landowner was 100% on the regulatory. They were not able to harvest anything. They received a denied application to harvest. And then, of course, we can see that, and they immediately, we don't need mill receipts, or we can see that from an air photo, we can see it from a forest practice application, and they do qualify for the high impact threshold. Okay, for the unstable slopes, it is complex also, like the difference between the qualifying timber compensation and the actual easement compensation, or the qualifying timber value and the easement compensation. Unstable slopes, if you are, as a landowner, have or believe that you have unstable slopes, your first thing that you want to do is identify to the forest practice forester who is out on your property that you are intending to apply for a FREP. Voluntary trees are not eligible to be included in the easement compensation. That's in the definition, that's RCW. So what we have to have is documentation that verifies that the trees on unstable slopes are required to be left. Again, that's in RCW, and it's right there. And it says that it must be addressed in the FPA. If a landowner chooses to bound it out, then they are doing that by their choice, voluntary. A geotech report that covers the area within the FREP is 100% reimbursable. And that's reimbursed at the time that the easement is signed and the compensation is given to the landowner.
Is that with interest?
No, it is not.
Yeah, so we're running between a rock and a hard place here, but keep going on this. This is another really hot topic, Mary.
Okay, it's like I said, the decisions are based in RCW.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, to be honest with you, anytime that a geotech report comes in, there is a small example of when we wouldn't, and that's when like a landowner were to break up a harvest or an upland area into 2 different forest practice applications, and then we would only reimburse them for the portion of the geotech report that's on that FPA, and then wait for the other FPA to come in. But I would say majority, 99% of the time, a geotech report, the cost is reimbursed at the time of a FREP.
So we had some examples, and I think we submitted that in the questions where you had this situation where you have a stream, you have a channel migration zone, and you have a real steep slope. And when the forest practices forester is out there, they come to an agreement with the landowner, hey, we should put it at the top of the slope. No geotech report. But if they didn't put it at the top of the slope, if they put it partway down the slope, which would be within 130 feet or 20 feet or whatever from the stream bank, the permit potentially would be denied. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place here. And I think this is one of the places where when we look at the RCW and say, hey, you're not eligible because you don't have a geotech report, but we're not going to approve it unless you get a geotech report or unless you put it at the top of the slope, you can see how that kind of puts that?
Yeah, just a forest practice forester and if a landowner come to an agreement, there is no documentation, there is no geotech report. That is something that a landowner and a forest practice forester and the landowner agreed to. And so that is not required by the landowner to leave those. If they came to that agreement, the landowner voluntarily left it. And I hate to be so black and white, but for a forest practice forester to require trees to be left outside the existing rule, they have to have documentation. And that documentation is a geotech report.
So if the forest practices forester denied the permit because you were part way down that slope,
and then they would probably say, you're denied that permit because I need more information, and that information is a geotech report.
so this becomes I think one of those issues where technical assistance rises to the top of the technical assistance bucket here, because you're looking at potentially getting paid for this 5 or 6 years out. Your geotech report, I don't know what they might be, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, maybe more. That's a lot of money to put out for something that may or may not be accepted or verified by the department. But this is, I think, good to know, because this will be something that people will have to judge how they're going to go about doing that in the future. And I think talk with the department. Frankly, I think this is something where the department and technical assistance is needed.
First and foremost is, that's the very first thing I have, is inform your forest practice forester that you intend to do a FREP, and then contact SFLO, because you want to know and then that geotechnical report, it can go both ways. It can allow you to do a thinning, maybe, and that's where you're going to have the science behind what you have to and the documentation about what is required to be left and what is not required to be left. But then
Tammy,
again, go ahead.
Tammy, does DNR still have a list of published geotech engineers that we have to use off the list?
I think the forest practices would have that, I would imagine.
Yes, they do. They're certified experts in the forest practice department. Yes, each region has a list of geotechnical.
Yeah, a big problem that we'd had in the past was we're often paying $500 to $1,000 or more per day for a geotech engineer, and then the DNR geologists would disagree with what our geotech said. And then we're having meetings up in Olympia where we're paying our consultant $500 to $1,000 a day to sit down and argue about a geotech report. And we need some certainty. It would be great if DNR would look at our property, your geologist, and tell us what we can or can't cut, and then let us either go with that, or if we are unhappy with that, then we could challenge that with our own reports.
So that's getting really into forest practices and regulatory, Howard. And I guess we have to say that it's really, as far as what is going to be cut and what is not going to be cut, that's into the forest practices and not so much the small forest landowner office.
One positive thing is that small forest landowner is hiring more foresters like Todd Olson that can come out hopefully and answer questions like that when you're prior to a harvest, and they may be able to help out with that type of thing. So hopefully in the future we'll have more staff available to small forest landowners to hopefully avoid that situation. But all they can give is guidance. They can't. They're not going to be able to say what's unstable or not unstable.
That's exactly right, Dan, and I just wanted to chime in here. The regulation assistance foresters are not geologists, and so they're not going to be able to identify areas that need to be bounded out or not to. They will be able to say, I suggest that you get a geologist to come out and identify your areas, but the regulation assistance foresters won't be doing that. They're not qualified to do that.
Could the small forest landowner office have a geologist on staff?
Not at this time, we don't.
Yeah, but could you, I guess is the question. Is that something where you would look at that as providing a service that was necessary to both implement your role as supporting small forest landowners within this regulatory realm? Because yes, it might be regulation, it's the regulatory part, but the small forest landowners have to deal with that regulatory part. So it's like, how do we figure out how to thread this needle, and is there a big enough demand to do it? Now, I don't know, maybe people are just saying, just leaving their steep pieces of land alone and not even dealing with it, which leaves a lot of timber behind that has some benefits, it has some costs, particularly if it's still in designated forest land and you have counties that aren't getting that money because it's not harvested.
Yeah,
So
and I think you made a good point, as we would have to take a look at if there's enough work for a geologist to be on staff. One of the things that we found is there's not a whole lot of landowners that harvest on unstable slopes or have unstable slopes, but we would have to take a deeper dive into looking at whether it would be feasible for us to have a geologist on staff.
Yeah, I think the harvests are limited because it's so hard.
What was that, Howard?
I bought a piece of property in 2005, and at the time I didn't have LiDAR on it, and I didn't know it had 2 deep-seated landslides areas under it. Some of it probably is harvestable, some of it isn't, but the hurdles and the costs have kept me from trying to do anything with it.
Can I jump in real quick, Tammy and
Sure.
Mary? This is Todd Olson in Regulation Assistance. Just to offer another suggestion is the pre-application review process. So, and oftentimes they will be able to, the forest practices forester will be able to facilitate having a forest practices geologist come out when it has to do with an application. So if you have a draft ready and the area has been flagged out or marked, they can help with that in terms of the pre-application review. And that's also where regulation assistance can provide some help for you too.
That's a really good suggestion, Todd, and a pre-application review for a landowner to get an idea. And then they would have to make their assessment on whether they feel that there's enough timber out there to be worth the value to do a geotech report. And I want to respect Elaine's first thing, and we're happy to answer additional questions. But I know that you have a lot more questions besides just the unstable slopes, and just to keep going, if that's okay.
yeah, we're 7 minutes to countdown, and people, if you have questions, put them in the chat. I think a lot of them have been answered as we're going through. So that'll allow us to move pretty quickly.
Okay, I'm trying to. Okay, notification. One of the questions is, how soon do we find out that I have put in a forest riparian easement application, and what do we have to do, and how is SFLO notifying landowners? Okay, so first off, when we're putting in our budget request prior to the biennium, we have to put together a list of how many applicants are out there and our estimated cost. And I'll give you a list, but it's on the LEAP list, and you'd be able to see the landowner and the type of information. And we put that together. That goes to the legislature when we're building a budget each biennium. And so there is that. We also send out letters to landowners once we have received their FREP applications. And as far as how soon and when do we know that a cruise is going to be on a landowner's property to cruise the qualifying timber? As part of the cruise, SFLO will we notify the landowner that they are on the upcoming cruise contract. And then as part of the cruise contract, the cruiser does also notify the landowner that their property is getting ready to be cruised. And anytime you can contact SFLO and find out what the status of your application is. We hope to be able to do more updating the status of applications, like once every 6 months is what we're going to plan on doing. I also wanted to share with you when I mentioned what we have to provide the legislature for our budget request is this list, and this is what was provided to the legislature back in March. We developed it in March. It was probably provided to the legislature in September. And it goes through, and this might not be something that, this is something that we were considering just posting on the SFLO website under FREP. It identifies the ranking of a FREP as to when the application came in. The landowner's name is the project name, the nearest city, the legislative district, and the estimated. This again makes sure that nobody has been out there on the property. This is all estimated from a map, and then the estimated value. And this estimated value is, again, we are very, very hesitant in sharing any of this information directly with the landowner because they have expectations once they see a dollar number. And like again, I said, things change, whether the value grows because there's additional RMZ that can be included, or this area doesn't. Once we get someone out there on the site, all these estimates are estimates, and nobody has been out there on site when we are projecting this.
So these are the ones that would need to be cruised, for example. So you're guessing this based on sort of map data, but you haven't actually cruised them.
Not at all. We haven't even been out there one time. And before we can cruise them, we have to make a map. We have to verify what's out there. And then we go out there and we let the cruise contract. So none of that has been done. We're looking at something at a map. We're taking a broad brush of, okay, it looks like it's mostly conifer. Well, let's put in 250,000 per acre, and we make it's an estimate. You can see how many of those digits are 704, because it's an estimate.
It's all the same number. It
Exactly.
should probably at least be rounded to the nearest 1,000, and then people would know that it's just a wild guess.
Mm-hmm.
This is Bill Hundley, small landowner, and I have a question I'd like to get in before our time's up. I did not submit it earlier. I just wanted to raise my hand. We have a 500-acre tree farm between Cle Elum and Easton. You all know where it is because you drive by it on I-90. It's right at Golf Course Road, and you look over and you say, oh, that's where the elk are. Well, that's our property. My question is, after we've been approved, by the way, and in next month, we're going to have our first boots on the ground FREP people come out and do whatever they're going to do. My question is, after this is all said and done and the landowner has a big wad of dough, and then the landowner is looking at the next 50 years providing stewardship for that property. Stewardship, I mean fireizing it, keeping it healthy from the bugs, the beetles. That's what we have in Kittitas County. What can we do and what can't we do? What do you do when you have root rot? Who does the landowner talk to about stewardship in land that has been approved for FREP? I mean, normally you'd remove some trees. Otherwise, you're going to have a tree jungle. Is there somebody we can talk to about that?
You can certainly talk to SFLO at any time, but I guess as just a word of caution, and I understand about root rot and the trees that's the intent of the riparian easement program, is for the trees to remain on the property. And yeah, and so
you just
if they
sit
fall
back and
down,
watch?
that's where we want them. We want them left there by the creek or wherever. And with insects, that definitely poses a problem.
What about fire?
And if fire occurs, that's an act of God, and that's it. The landowner has been compensated, and that happened after the easement has been executed, and there is no obligation for you to go back and plant or anything.
Tammy, Howard Wilson, the FREP only covers the trees that were of commercial value when the FREP was issued. So if brush is growing or small trees are sprouting up, the landowner should be able to go in and remove those small trees to keep them from becoming a fire hazard. They can't remove the large trees, which they were paid for by FREP. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's
But you
correct.
could go in and masticate and things like this.
I'm sorry?
You could go in and masticate the small trees that are going to be a tree jungle.
So, you know, what you would want to do is contact us, and we would be able to share with you the crews. So you would be able to get a pretty good idea of the types of trees that were paid for on the FREP, and the smaller trees, but that you're not required to. I guess I want to, that would be, you know, if you chose to go in there and masticate and get rid of the brush or the smaller trees, that would be permissible, again, on a site by site. I don't want to do a carte blanche, but have somebody come out there.
Yeah,
Most of us want to provide stewardship for the land. And,
No,
and
I know.
we're not buying into the act of God, you know.
right.
No,
Sorry. Most of us don't believe in that for
Yeah.
firewising.
Yeah. No, this is Alex Smith. I think one of the things we're building out as a result of the legislature's big investment in House Bill 1168 is we're building out what we're calling a service forestry capacity, especially in Western Washington, but also Eastern Washington. And I think the goal would be to have a service forester, that's going to be the new title for them, be able to go out with on your land and understanding the restrictions that the easement provides, also be able to help you identify areas where you can go out and do thinning, you can go out and get rid of the stuff that would be good fuel for a fire, and just help improve the health of that riparian area. So hear what you're saying, and the goal is to have folks available to do that with you.
Very encouraging.
And Bill, you're speaking my language here, and I want to have some more deeper conversation about this, and maybe at some point be able to go out and visit when Kittitas again starts meeting in person and talk about these things, because there is this intersection between the rules and the regulations and the easements, what is and isn't allowed, and the realities of fire. And at some point, we need to look at that as a community, a forestry community, a forest sector, not just as small forest landowners. A couple more quick questions. We're 5 minutes over. There was something from Heather about the mistakes in contracts. How many applications had errors that resulted in delay, and how can the error rate be reduced?
We don't keep track of errors, to be honest with you, Heather and Elaine. What we do is we try to correct them as soon as possible. And there are a couple of things that I'd want to point out is the foresters that we hire each biennium, and it happens about every 2 years, and we're lucky if we get the FREP foresters to stay with us. It's because of two things, because of their funding is tied to the biennium and getting appropriated from the legislature every 2 years so that we know that we have a job. And then the job that they do is essentially, I would say a first time out of school job for a forester. It is going out and identifying, and so it's like a starting position for a DNR forester. And once they have some experience, they frequently and most often they do promote. And so that we are constantly going through training and on forest riparian easement foresters. Also, regarding the conservation easements and escrow, there are also some mistakes that happen in escrows. And escrow companies are frequently dealing with real estate transactions from homes when people are selling homes. And they are not, it's unique to deal with the state as far as acquiring an easement for the state. And so there are some nuances to that. And what we are trying to do there is limit the number of escrow agencies that we are working with FREP, because once they become familiar with it, then we don't seem to have as many problems. Initially, what we wanted to do was, I would say, spread the work out to all of the other agency or all the other escrow companies, like in these smaller communities where the easements are taking place, but then they are not familiar with the conservation easements working with the state, and that's caused us some delays. So there's kind of a trade-off there where we were hoping to, like I said, spread the wealth of doing easements and escrows to the smaller rural areas, but then they're not familiar and it takes a lot longer.
Yeah, good point. Good point. One last question. When was the last time FREP was audited, and how do we get a copy of the audit?
Oh, as far as I know, it's never been audited.
Okay.
Not that I know of either. Dan, do you have any recollection of it being audited?
I'm trying to work. Yeah, my mic thing's not working. Yes, it has been audited. It was audited when in the previous commissioner. So it's been what, probably 8 years, 9 years now.
Okay. Commissioner, do we have a copy of that?
I'm looking for it.
Okay.
What we'll do is we'll get it to you if we should have a copy of it. What I want to speak very quickly to is we have 6.8 million. We usually have 2 foresters. We now have 3 FREP foresters, the third one coming on just Monday. Like I mentioned previously, we have a large amount of cruises that we plan on doing. We feel that we can, once we do have a cruise completed on an application, if a landowner was interested in acquiring that cruise, if they were to let their FREP forester or Dan know, we'd be able to provide that cruise to them. That was one of the questions. And what we're hoping to do to be able to decrease the amount of cancellations or the ineligible landowners is to get a welcome packet out soon with the applications. And we hope to be able to do that in the next coming months. And with the 6.8 million, what we did last year is we acquired 34. We're going to have 80 conservation easements is our estimate that we think that we'll be able to acquire this year, this biennium with the 6.8. That is a lot of work, and we're doing everything we can to be able to do that. That being said, it's going to diminish our backlog by quite a bit, probably over 50%, and we are very excited about being able to do that.
Mary, if I can add a little bit more to the welcome packet. We're going to try to put a list of frequently asked questions, and we're going to put in the welcome packet better explanation about the 10-year moratorium, more information about what to expect, how the process works, and that way we can get that. And we're going to contact them personally and ask and talk to the landowners and provide them with as much information as we can to keep these easements moving forward and keep them from dropping out halfway through. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do. The 34 easements that we purchased last year, I think we had a $3.5 million budget, and now we have 6.4, and we're going to try to do 80. So that's, yeah, it's going to be a big workload, but I think it's going to really be helpful to get the waiting list down to about half. So that'll be maybe a 2.5-year waiting time versus a 5-year.
That is awesome.
And why, just quickly, why there's so many easements, 80 as compared to when we didn't, the easement value that we are estimating are not as high. We had quite a few high dollar easements and last biennium, and this upcoming biennium, there are not as many, and so there are more easements to acquire, and the amount of work that goes into an easement is the same whether it was like you saw earlier, whether it's $8,000 or $800,000. DNR has to do the same amount of work to accomplish that.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank you so much for putting this together for us and sitting here in the hot seat, if you will. And we really appreciate you stepping up and answering all these questions for us. And I think there was the last thing Ken put in the chat. We should all recognize that this is likely the very best program in the US, the world, to at least partially compensate for regulatory taking of private property rights. And then he gives himself and WFFA a pat on the back for that, because we did participate. But I think it also speaks well to the intent of the state to try to somehow recognize value, the values that we bring to the table.